Great. All right. So um, let me introduce myself. My name is Susan Troxel. I'm the chair of the Richard III Society American Branch. I'm joined today by Wayne Ingalls, our membership chair. And behind the scenes is our webmaster, Cheryl Greer. So we are here to give you a short presentation. Undoubtedly, some of you are here because you saw the Lost King movie about the life of Philippa Langley, or to say her fictionalized life as it was shown in the movie. And we want to make sure that we welcome both you and anyone else who's here just to learn more about our society. I want to welcome our new members who just joined, our longstanding members who've been with us for many decades, and those of you who are not even members yet, but you're here to find out more about who we are. So yes, as I said earlier, maybe you saw the movie The Lost King and you thought, is there really such a thing as a Richard III Society, or do they make that up? Well, I'm here to tell you, yes, indeed, there is a Richard III Society. And then maybe some of you saw the character of Richard III played by the very handsome Harry Lloyd character, and you were intrigued by him as a character, but you want to know more about the actual historical king. So over the next 45 minutes, what we would like to do is to provide you with a very basic presentation about the history, about the life of Richard III, who he was as a human being, what his role in history was, and introduce you a little bit to the big controversy over his reputation. And of course, we'll also briefly discuss what the goals of the Richard III Society are and what we do as a nonprofit, all volunteer educational organization, and how you can become a member. So for existing members, I'm sure some of this will be already familiar to you, especially some of the history, but we really welcome you to stay with us because we'll be walking through our website, which is relatively new. It went online about a year ago, 2 years ago. And there's a for members only page where you'll find lots of resources. And it's where you can manage your membership and renew, and you can find where you can access past publications of the Register and other newsletters. And you can also read important documents associated with our branch and its governance. So I do want to encourage questions and discussion about the movie, about Richard III and the history, and of course, any questions about our society. And I really want to encourage our newcomers, new members and non-members to ask questions. As they say, there are no stupid questions. You're so welcome to ask anything of us, and we'll do our best to answer them. And so the way we would ask you to ask questions is to put them into the chat bar at the bottom of your screen, or however you have it configured, but you can find the chat icon at the bottom center. And then we'll answer the questions at the bottom, at the end of the presentation. Or you could also hit the reaction button and raise your hand, and we can unmute you, and then you can ask a question verbally. But we would ask that you do that at the end of the presentation. So in the meanwhile, please keep your microphone and your video off. Please be aware that we are recording this to be uploaded to our private YouTube channel. And with that, I think we're ready to begin. So I am going to share my screen. Okay. There it is. There we are. Okay. Okay. So hopefully all of you can see the homepage of the Richard III Society. And if you can't, let us know in the chat. The question is that I want to address first is, who exactly is Richard III? And we're not talking about the fictional character in the Shakespeare play, but we're talking about the real man. So I wanted to take you to the website of our American branch, which is r3.org. And I want to show you where you can learn all about him as a human being. So as you can see, we have three main subpages. And you can find out everything about him on the Meet Richard III page. You can click on the image or down here on the link. So let's go there first. And of course, my computer is slow. There we go. Okay. So as you can see, this page starts out with the quick facts. These are like shorthand biographical facts about Richard III, when he was born in 1542, where he was born, Fotheringay Castle, Northamptonshire, who his parents were, his relationship to Edward IV, his oldest brother, who he married, and how many children they had, one son, that he fathered other children before he married, Catherine and John Plantagenet, whether he had scoliosis or a hunchback, his ducal title, which was Duke of Gloucester. That was what he had before he became king. He was crowned on July 6, 1483, and he died at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, losing to Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. So one thing I'm going to do here briefly is look a little closer at his parents, because it's his parents, it is through his parents that Richard III has any claim to be the rightful king of England. So hopefully you can see a pretty big family tree. And you'll find Richard III right at the lower right in red, where I'm circling. That's Richard III. And you can see he's the youngest of many children, although I think he had a younger sister, but she died in infancy. But he's the youngest of a very large family. He had an older brother, George, Duke of Clarence, sister Margaret, sister Elizabeth, brother Edmund, Edward IV, and then his sister, oldest sister, Anne. This was a very big family, very powerful family, and they're all the children of this power couple from the 15th century. Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and his wife, Cecily Neville. I want to tell you about these two because this is critical to understanding everything that happens in the late 15th century. Richard, Duke of York, as you can see, descends up the tree of his family history to the second son of Edward III. Edward III had many sons. He didn't just stop at the heir and spare. He had 5 sons: Edward the Black Prince, Lionel, John, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. So Richard III's father had a claim to be descended directly from Edward III through his second son. But he also had a claim to be directly descended from Edward III by the 4th son, Edmund, Duke of York. And you can see here's Richard, it's the same guy, Richard, Duke of York. So Richard, Duke of York is the son of Richard, Earl of Cambridge, who was the son of Edmund, Duke of York. So you can see this is how the House of York got its name, is from the ducal title of Edmund of Langley. So that's Richard's father. But what about his mother? You might recognize the Neville name. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but that was the big upstart powerhouse family that were very big deal and owned a lot of land and had a lot of money. She was the daughter of this woman over here in green, Joan Beaufort. Joan Beaufort was the daughter also of John, Duke of Lancaster. And also she could then claim that she's the granddaughter of Edward III. But there's a snag in this. When John and Gaunt had children with Catherine Swynford here, they were not married. They were having an extramarital affair when John and Joan were born. Thus, they were illegitimate children, and it took a great effort of their father, John of Gaunt, to have them legitimized by the Pope. But that was when they were well after their births. I think they must have been teenagers by then. And the other thing too, is you can see over here, also children of John, Duke of Lancaster, his oldest son, Henry IV, and then Henry V, Henry VI. These are what we call the House of Lancaster kings. they are born of a legitimate marriage with Blanche of Lancaster. So these are the legitimate side of John of Gaunt's family, and these are the illegitimate side. We call this the House of Lancaster because they come from the Duke of Lancaster. And these folks in green were barred by a statute of Parliament from inheriting the throne. They were not allowed, even after they were legitimized, they were forever forbidden from ever seeking the throne of England because of their illegitimate status. Unfortunately, it's very sad, but that's the way people were back then. It's very important if you were illegitimate. Unfortunately, you just could not inherit legally. So this is where we find the House of Lancaster and the Kings and the House of York. So I hope that helps a little bit. Then we're going to pop back onto the Meet Richard III page, and excuse me. I want to put aside at the very beginning the fact that Richard III did not have a hunchback. A hunchback is a medical condition that goes by the term kyphosis. And that is when the shoulders are literally bending forward, the spine is bending forward, and the head is carried very forward from the trunk of the body. That is not the condition that Richard III had. They have proven this when they found his skeletal remains in 2012, and they examined his spine, which you see a picture of here. Now, what he did have, according to the scientists at the University of Leicester, he had a condition known as idiopathic adolescent onset scoliosis. Idiopathic means he didn't inherit it. They don't know what caused it. It wasn't from a disease like tuberculosis or osteoporosis or anything like that. So we don't know what caused it. It was adolescent onset, which means Richard was born a completely normal child without any spinal condition. And he did not start to develop it until he reached puberty when he was 12 or 13. And then it would begin gradually. So, you probably didn't notice anything going on with his back when he was training as a young knight. And then it would have progressed. And scoliosis, of course, means a sideways curvature of the spine, which usually causes one shoulder to be raised higher than another, and maybe adds an asymmetry to the waist and to the torso. And this really matches up with the contemporary accounts of Richard III and how he looked. No one said he was disfigured or disabled or was even called a hunchback during his life. There was one observer who was a diplomat who said he was a very good-looking guy, but one shoulder seemed a little higher than another. So all the stuff you've ever read about him being horribly misshapen or having a withered arm or having a grossly deformed hunchback or a funny gait or weird legs or whatever you see on stage, that comes directly from Shakespeare and from sources that were written during the Tudor era under the new incoming dynasty. They had to make sure they kind of made the former dynasty look bad so that they could look good themselves. So you can look up more about scoliosis there. It's very interesting. People have it even today. I think Usain Bolt has it. Elizabeth Taylor had it. It's a very common condition. Now, I want to touch briefly on psychology. And up here, there's a video here, sorry, where someone who has the exact same scoliosis as Richard, his name is Dominic Smee. They gave him a 3-week period where he learned how to wear armor, how to use bladed weapons, and how to sit on a horse. And he has the exact same level of scoliosis that Richard III had, and it was able to accomplish all of these pretty well. So it goes to show that having scoliosis didn't really keep Richard from wearing armor or being a knight, or riding on horseback, or being an effective soldier. Under that is a really intriguing presentation here by Dr. Mark Lansdale at the University of Leicester. He is a forensic psychologist. You may have heard of that from CSI TV. Forensic psychologists review a person's full mental and medical history and their life, their whole biography, to see if they display any sort of personality disorders or conditions. And Dr. Lansdale examined everything, all of the sources about what was said about Richard, what he did during his life, what he did as a king, original sources and secondary sources. And he said, there's no way that I would ever find this guy to be some sort of psychopath or anything close to the character that you see in Shakespeare's play. Richard did not have what they call the dark triad of narcissism, lack of empathy, and Machiavellianism. He had none of that. In fact, he seemed to care about people during his life, and he seemed to be very aware about the law and wasn't, running roughshod over it all the time. So he at most said that, well, Richard had a pretty rough childhood in that he saw his father die. His father died when he was young. His brother, his second brother, Edmund, died when he was young. And then he had to flee Europe he had to flee England a couple times in order to preserve his life. And, I guess that may have given him some intolerance of uncertainty, and also maybe more reserved. Maybe he was a little more cautious because of the great disruptions that he lived through, but by no means was he a narcissistic psychopath. And this is a fabulous talk. If you want to look at it, I highly encourage you to do so. Overall on the right, I'm just going to go through these quickly. There's a whole section on the reconstruction of his face done by Dr. Carolyn Wilkinson, and a reconstruction of his voice. There's a project going on to discover what he would have sounded like. And you can click on those links for further information. And of course, we have a section on the discovery and reburial. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you can click on all these links and learn more about that. I do want to point out to you, if you want to be directed to any biographies, we have a couple listed here. Paul Murray Kendall, Matthew Lewis, Annette Carson, and Peter Hammond's books are especially excellent. Highly recommend them. And if you are a member, you can borrow them from our library. And then we have under Ricardian Places, we have a bunch of links here, which will take you to the websites of these organizations and castles and other historical properties, which have a very significant relationship to Richard III. Okay, so that basically takes you through the Meet the Richard III page. Who was he, just basically as a human being? But the next question is, what was his historical context and what was his role in history? And you're going to be able to find all that out in this page over here, the Learn page. So let's click on that. All right, so this takes you to a timeline, some primary source material from both the 15th century and also the Tudor times in the 16th century. These are all links that will take you to these materials that you could read for yourself. And then we have a section on controversy, which I'll get to in a little bit. But let's go to the timeline. So the most important thing to know about Richard III is that he's the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty in England. Now, this dynasty was established by this couple right here, Empress Matilda and her second husband, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. This was a real power couple too. Anyway, it's through Matilda that the crown passes to her son, who was Henry, and Henry becomes Henry II. She is the daughter of the only surviving legitimate child, actually, of Henry I of England. So that's why she has a claim to the throne of England. She's the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I. And you may recall that she was in something called the Anarchy, where she was battling over the English crown with her cousin Stephen. She lost that, but I guess in the long run, she kind of won it because her son became the next king of England. So it's important to know that the Plantagenet dynasty was really based on a woman's claim to the throne. Now, 300 years later, Richard III was born and lived during a period called the Wars of the Roses. That was fought between the House of York, whose emblem was the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, which was symbolized by a red rose. Now, this started out as a struggle over who had access to the king, Henry VI, who could influence him by sitting on his council and making the important decisions. Henry VI was the son of the military hero Henry V, and he was the great grandson of John, Duke of Lancaster, and thus part of the House of Lancaster. He was a very religious man, but he was also a very weak leader, and he could be very easily influenced. Basically, he followed whatever his counselors told him to do. Now, it's also important to realize that the Wars of the Roses occurred within the context of the 100 Years' War between England and France. That started in 1337 with Edward III claiming the crown of France, saying that he was the rightful king of France. And as you probably remember, Henry V of England famously defeated the French at Agincourt in 1415 and was named next in line to inherit the French crown. He was next in line to be the French king. But he died 5 years later, and the French, of course, were never going to allow or accept an Englishman to sit on their throne. So the war in France kept dragging on and on and on. And it became terribly expensive for the English to keep paying for it. People became divided. There were some who wanted to win the war against France at all cost, no matter what it took. And then there were others who believed it had become a complete waste of money and that you should seek an honorable peace with France. So much like today in our current state of hyper-partisanship, England was very prone to factionalism and people taking opposite sides on an issue, and they felt very strongly about it. So if you go into the timeline itself, I'm going to skip over much of this background, but just to try to keep things as succinct as possible. I want to show you where in all of this Richard III is born. It comes down, there he is. There's Richard III. He's born in 1452. And if I had to go back a little bit to say where the seeds of this Wars of the Roses started, you can kind of see the seeds of it planted in Cade's Rebellion. And that happened 2 years before Richard III was born. This was a significant rebellion, just as awful and big as the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, if you know that. That was a very serious challenge to the authority of the king. This, too, was equally serious and disruptive. Jack Cade came from the southeast of England. He raised a massive force, or some people call them a mob, and they started in the southeast of England. They gathered together under a common set of grievances about the corruption, maladministration, and abuse of power of the king's closest advisors and local officials, as well as all the military losses in France during the 100 Years' War. So these people marched on London. I think they broke into London. They killed a couple of the king's advisors and ultimately were dispersed. And Jack Cade himself was submitted to the execution of a treason. You know, he was drawn, quartered, hung, and all that awful stuff. So this is a very disruptive event in the reign of Henry VI, and it probably did not bode well for him. So one thing to understand is that when Henry VI became king, he was only 8 months old. He was the son of the great military hero, but being an 8-month baby meant that you could not govern for yourself. And he never had the training of a Prince of Wales. He never had that period that most boys would get when they're Princes of Wales, where you could learn and take your time and learn how to govern for yourself. He never had that opportunity. He was always under a council of men who were telling him how to govern, what to do, and he was pretty much dependent on them, utterly dependent on them for what the wisest decisions would be. Now, the problem with that is he tended to make his own kinfolk. He surrounded himself with his own kinfolk, and he put those people on his innermost council. So we have the king who surrounded himself with his paternal uncles and his cousins from the Beaufort line. Remember that Beaufort line, the illegitimate line. Now, it's natural, of course, that he would have, surrounded himself with his relatives. But after a while, people started to think that it looked a lot like cronyism. And especially when the war was going bad in France and the economics in England were going bad, there were a couple of famines and all that, it was not very good. And of course, they start blaming the people who were around the king for giving him bad advice. Now, Richard III's father was the Duke of York, probably one of the wealthiest men in England, and had vast estates and a vast affinity and retinue. But he wasn't really part of Henry VI's inner circle. He never sat on the council. And people started to think, hey, that guy deserves more of a role in the king's government. And we think that the family of the king is unfairly ostracizing him. So the Duke of York was sort of a figurehead for, I guess, a movement of discontented people with how the government was going and how it was being ruled. And even though the Duke of York was made Lord Protector, when Henry VI suffered 2 mental breakdowns and became catatonic, the Duke of York was quickly pushed aside as soon as the king recovered and the king's Lancastrian relatives were reinstated. So the Wars of the Roses are considered to have started with this battle, the Battle of St. Albans, May 1455. This is not really a battle. It's more like a skirmish that turned really deadly. And the 2 factions that were skirmishing were those on the king's side, the relatives of the king, and those the Duke of York and those who supported him. And what they were fighting over was who had access to and control over the king. And the Duke of York had been saying to his followers that he needed to be part of the inner circle. And he attracted to himself the powerful Neville family from up north of England, and especially the Earl of Salisbury and his son, the Earl of Warwick. Now, they're both named Richard Neville, which is very confusing, but today we know the son, the Earl of Warwick, as the Kingmaker. This is a family that was incredibly powerful, as I said earlier. And when the Duke of York got their support, they then became a very significant voice in politics of England. So more conflicts occur. This is a major battle, the Battle of Ludford Bridge. This was more of a pitched battle, although it wasn't really fought because the Lancastrians showed up, outnumbered the Yorkists, and some of the Yorkist people defected, they fled the field. And it was a total disaster for the Yorkists. The Duke of York fled to Ireland. His eldest son, Edward, fled, I think, to Europe, and Richard III was kept in house arrest for a while and then later fled to Burgundy. But we need to know about the Parliament of Devils of 1459. This was when the Yorkists were charged and convicted of high treason, and they were attainted, meaning that they were stripped of all their land and all of their rights. And this was a real turning point in the Wars of the Roses, as at this point, as they never were before, the Yorkists were now in danger of being captured and summarily executed. So their lives were in danger. They had already lost their property. The king is still surrounded by his Lancastrian cousins, and the Duke of York makes a decision to revive an ancient claim that he inherited as per his family tree, that in fact, he, the Duke of York, had better claim to the throne than Henry VI and his parents and his grandparents, because the Duke of York says, I descend from the second son of Edward III, and you Lancastrians descend from the junior son, the third son. So all of you were illegitimate kings. You should never have been king. You deposed Richard II unfairly without just cause, and you should have put Richard II's true heir on the throne. That would have been Edmund Mortimer, excuse me, who was the son of Lionel. So this shows a distinct change from fighting over who has access to the king to now who should be wearing the crown of England. So the stakes have become really high at this point. And now the Duke, unfortunately, the Duke of York dies at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. Terrible defeat. And also his second son, Edmund, dies. This is a terrible event. But fortunately, his oldest son, Edward, is over in Wales, and he's raising a force, and he takes on his father's claim to the throne and wages this battle of Mortimer's Cross, where he sees the three sons, and he wins. He wins over the Tudors. And then, just to cut quick, he wins this decisive battle, the Battle of Towton. This was where Edward IV leads the Yorkist forces against the forces of Henry VI. It's one king versus another. Edward was already calling himself Edward IV, and London was fully behind him. And the Lancastrians were saying, okay, this is it, we're gonna go. This is gonna be the final battle. And as you know, it's one of the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. It's a disaster for the Lancastrians. They're defeated. It's horrible. People, like up to 28,000 were killed. That's probably very high. It was probably something less than that. But the upshot is that Henry VI flees. He runs off the field and is somewhere in the north. His queen escapes to Scotland, then to France. And all the people who supported the Duke of Lancaster, or the Lancastrian side, they fled to France, including Henry Tudor. And Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, would live in France from this point on until 1485, when he invades England to take the crown himself. So Edward IV returns to London and becomes king. And I'm just going to say what the shocking event of his reign, his early reign was. It was the disclosure that he had married a woman in secret, Elizabeth Woodville. Now, this was a secret marriage. No, it was not publicly announced. It wasn't disclosed to Parliament. It wasn't disclosed to the House of Lords or any of the peers. And it certainly wasn't disclosed to Edward's own council or any of his officials or people he governed with. And it was shocking because she was a widow and already had kids. And she was a Lancastrian. She was married to a Lancastrian. And here she is marrying the Yorkist king. Well, this really pissed off the kingmaker because he was actually in France right at this point and trying to negotiate Edward IV's marriage to a French princess. He finds out when everyone else finds out, and he's furious about it. Now, this is disclosed in 1464, was a shocking disclosure. People in the public were shocked. And, but they kind of accepted it after a while. But the kingmaker never forgot about it. It stuck in his craw. And ultimately, he decides, well, if I don't know who this guy is marrying, then I'm never gonna be a kingmaker with him. I'm never gonna be his closest ally. So he defects to the Lancastrian side. And the Lancastrian side is over in France with the queen, the ousted queen, and they're planning an invasion to take the crown off of Edward IV and put it back on Henry VI, who's being kept in the Tower of London at this point. So to cut to the chase, the kingmaker has defected to the Lancastrian side. He then faces Edward IV, in the Battle of Barnet. There you go. The Battle of Barnet, the Kingmaker assembles his forces, including the Earl of Oxford, and he faces off with Edward IV and his brother Richard, and they fight. And this is a big win for the Yorkist party, but a huge defeat for the Lancastrians because the Kingmaker is killed. That's huge defeat. And then shortly after that, the Queen, the ousted Queen comes. She arrives in France. She marches with her own army, and she meets the Edward IV's troops again at the Battle of Tewkesbury. And this is basically the last battle of the Wars of the Roses until Bosworth. And this was again a huge victory for the Yorkists and a terrible defeat for the Lancastrians. Henry VI had one son, his own Prince of Wales, it was also called Edward, and he's killed. So the Prince of Wales is killed. Many other leaders of the Lancastrian party were killed. And shortly thereafter, Henry VI is killed in the Tower of London. So at this point in 1471, there are really no Lancastrians standing who could claim the throne, except for Henry Tudor maybe, but he's not really a Lancastrian. He's more of the Beaufort side, and he's living in France, so he's not much of a concern at this point in time. So the other really shocking event, Edward IV then goes back to London, and he reigns for the next 12 years. Relative peace, relative calm, no more Wars of the Roses. The one big controversy that happens early on in his reign is that there's an argument between Richard, the future Richard III, over whether he is allowed to marry Anne Neville, who's a daughter of the Kingmaker. And brother George, Duke of Clarence, vigorously opposes it, and they fight over that for a couple of years. But ultimately, Richard wins the argument. The king grants the marriage to Anne Neville. And at this point, Richard, who has already received many of the castles that the Kingmaker used to have, and he now receives Anne Neville's inheritance, and that makes him a very wealthy man, very wealthy man. But that was a big controversy at the time, whether he should be able to marry Anne Neville. And then the next big controversy, and one that probably many of you are familiar with, is that Edward IV executes his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence was an odd guy. He himself had defected to the Lancastrian cause in the late 1460s. He seemed to be put out when he wasn't given the status that he thought he desired. He was kind of the heir presumptive before Edward IV had his own sons, and he was sort of a troublemaker a bit. He was executed for very dodgy reasons, but the official story is in the parliamentary rolls. And the official story is that he declared himself to be an heir to the throne directly, that he was making a challenge to Edward IV for the throne of England. And that probably came, though, when he was on the Lancastrian side. But Edward IV then says, you know, the reason why I really executed him was because he was saying that I was not using law, I was not fairly using law and prosecuting those that George said had poisoned his wife. So George was accusing the king of not administering law in the proper way, or even, you know, prosecuting people who he said had murdered his wife. And George was furious about that and went into a public meeting of the Royal Council and accused the king of failing to apply the law and to follow the law and charge these people. Well, you don't do that to a king in public. It's, you know, humiliating to say the least. But that was the reason why Edward IV, he said he deserved to die and be executed as a traitor for high treason. Of course, there's another theory as to why George, Duke of Clarence, was executed, and that is that he knew that his older brother, Edward IV, had secretly married another woman called Eleanor Butler 2 years before he went through another secret marriage with Elizabeth Woodville, his queen. And George tipped his hand that he had this information, and Edward IV got wind of this and was very concerned if this got out into the public. Because if it did, if this story got out into the public, it would be a significant challenge to his family and to his children's right to inherit the throne. What it means that is that his children by Elizabeth Woodville were all illegitimate and could not inherit the throne of England. So some people theorize that George was executed for that reason. So what was Richard III's role in history? I have skipped over a lot of information and haven't yet mentioned Richard's specific role in Edward's reign. As said earlier, he was made Duke of Gloucester at age 9, then High Constable of England, High Admiral, and Great Chamberlain at age 17. Now, Richard was too young to fight in any of the earlier battles of the Wars of the Roses, but he played a significant role in the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, where he led the vanguard of the army and demonstrated his prowess as a soldier. A popular poem of the day celebrated his military skills and his wisdom in leadership. As Duke of Gloucester, and the second most powerful person in England, aside from the king, Richard became a respected figure, especially in the north, where he had all of his lands from his wife and from the kingmaker, and where they set up their principal residence at Middleham in Yorkshire. It's also where they had their son Edward, who was born in Middleham. That's he's called Edward of Middleham. And it was through Richard's efforts, he built what Rosemary Horrocks at Cambridge University calls the greatest affinity of the 15th century. And that means that he formed strong bonds of loyalty with others. He was seen as the king's most trusted representative, and after being made warden of the West March, was charged with protecting the border with Scotland from raids and aggressions. He was often asked to arbitrate legal disputes and between people, and was said to have taken that role very seriously. It would not show favoritism to any party, not even to someone in his own retinue. He developed a special relationship with the city of York by petitioning the king on its behalf to improve its infrastructure. His success in all of this is reflected in the fact that Edward made him president of the Council of the North, which was a new body created by Edward IV that consisted of all the major northern noblemen and gentry, and it was formed for the purpose of administering the king's justice, adjudicating complaints and claims, and keeping the peace. Richard was seen as well suited for this role. And in fact, Richard always seemed to have an interest in the fair administration of the law. Just to jump forward briefly, you see this in Richard III's only parliament in 1484, when he was king. In that, he proposed the extension of bail to criminal defendants and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Another law required that juries on the sheriff's courts must consist of local men rather than outsiders who had been bribed by a party to sit on the jury panel. Another statute forbade the harassment of buyers and sellers at the market courts by requiring complaints to be made under oath. And finally, several reforms were made in the area of property law to ease the process of proving title to land and to deter fraud in property conveyances. Again, Professor Horrocks at Cambridge University says, Richard was quite genuine in his concern for the well-being of the common people. And according to the 19th century Chancellor and Chief Justice, Lord Campbell, quote, "We have no difficulty in pronouncing Richard's Parliament the most meritorious National Assembly for protecting the liberty of the subjects and putting down abuses in the administration of justice that has ever sat in England since the reign of Henry III. That Richard had always remained loyal to his brother during his life and his family is really undisputed. And we see that when Richard entrusted the Scottish Wars to Richard, and gave him the title of Lieutenant General of the Royal Army, which he led into Scotland in 1482. In this campaign, the Scottish were driven out of the city of Berwick upon Tweed, and it was finally returned to English possession. Richard's army ventured as far north as Edinburgh, where he admonished his troops not to loot or pillage or otherwise create havoc there. At Edward IV's last parliament in January 1483, the king rewarded Richard with a palatinate of his own on the northwest border of Scotland. A palatinate meaning that it's a region that was controlled, policed, governed, and defended by someone other than the king or emperor, and that would be Richard, Duke of Gloucester. It was an extraordinary gift, and it symbolized the deep and utter trust that Edward IV had in his younger brother. So I just spoke a lot about the good deeds of Richard III. How is it that he's one of England's most controversial kings? And how is it that even some historians seem to have a strong dislike of him? So I want to discuss very briefly the three reasons why I think he is so controversial. The first reason goes back to when Edward IV dies and how Richard III takes the crown, how he becomes King of England. It's not the usual way, which is the father who's wearing the crown dies and the oldest son becomes king, nor is it like the way Edward IV and Henry Tudor took the crown, which is just by conquest or on the battlefield. He takes it in a different way entirely. So what happens? Edward IV dies. His two only sons are 12 years old, and the oldest one is Edward V, 12-year-old Edward V, and the younger son is Richard, Duke of York. They're far too young to govern on their own. So the king, on his deathbed, names his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm until such time as the young king could rule on his own. So some element, though, of panic set in London. The Queen and her family start to dominate discussion at the Royal Council level, and they're trying to push the boy's coronation through as fast as possible. But they're doing this without the Lord Protector and the king's uncle being present himself when all these decisions are being made. He's still up in Yorkshire when he found out about his brother passing away suddenly, and it takes him several days to get to London. You may have heard about this meeting. Richard III encounters the retinue of Edward V, and he takes custody of them. And I won't get into the details there, but the bottom line is that Richard comes down to London. He has Edward V in his custody, and he puts himself into the position of Lord Protector. But at some point, Bishop Robert Stillington comes forward with information that really changes the course of history. Stillington reports that he had personally officiated a marriage between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler a few years before Edward married Woodville. So like the later marriage to Woodville, Edward's marriage to Butler was secret, was conducted without the required reading of banns, without public announcement. So under English law and church law, that meant that Edward IV could not be legally married to Woodville, and that all of their children were illegitimate. So at this point, people start to see that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as the only viable candidate to sit on the throne. And a petition was put forward to make him king, which he accepts. Now, the document that justifies his right to the throne is called Titulus Regius, the title of the king. And in that document, it describes the basis for why Richard III deserved to be King of England. It said that Edward IV had married in secret without the reading of banns or the consent of the lords and peers of the realm, and that he had already married Eleanor Butler. When Henry Tudor defeats Richard III at Bosworth, he tries to destroy every copy of Titulus Regius in the land, and he makes it a crime for anyone to have a copy of it. But fortunately, the monks at Crowland Abbey retained a copy in their chronicle, And that is the only way we know why Richard III was offered the crown. And to go to the section on controversy, there we go. Under our sources here, this is the Learn page. You can find Titulus Regius here, and you can read it for yourself. And you can look at Philip de Comines, who wrote about the evidence that was supplied to substantiate that secret marriage to Eleanor Butler. And yeah, it's very interesting. So you can take a look at all of these sources and come to your own conclusions, read them. So that was definitely a highly controversial move on Richard III's part, to become England in that way. And I think that definitely makes him a controversial figure of history. I think the second reason is probably known to all of you, and that's because he is alleged to have murdered his nephews, or what we call the princes in the Tower. And we would know that they were last seen practicing archery in the Tower grounds in the summer of 1483. There's a lot of theories about what happened to the princes. Of course, one of the suspects is Richard III himself. One theory says that they were killed on his orders. Others believe that the Duke of Buckingham, who was descended from Edward III's youngest son, Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, killed them himself in order to make way for his own attempt to win the crown. Some think that Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, killed them or had them killed to make way for her son to become King of England. And of course, Henry Tudor himself is a prime suspect because the princes represented probably the most serious obstacle to his claim on the throne. All of these people had motive and opportunity to do away with the princes. Another line of thinking is that the princes were sent away to live elsewhere, in hiding, or living under an assumed identity. For instance, one theory says that Edward V was sent to Ireland and became known as Lambert Simnel, while his brother, the young Duke of York, was sent to Burgundy and became known as Perkin Warbeck. A more recent theory has emerged that Edward V was sent to live under an assumed name in Coleridge, Devon. And finally, another line of thinking says that the princes just died of natural causes while they were in custody in the Tower. There is some suggestion that Edward V may have been suffering from a dental abscess, and this was a common cause of death in the medieval age. I would probably refer you to Matt Lewis's book called The Survival of the Princes in the Tower for the fullest treatment on all the theories of what happened to the princes. It's a really engaging book. Matt is the current chair of the Richard III Society in the UK, and he's very knowledgeable. But you could also look at this video of the trial of King Richard III that was conducted in 1484. And if you see this man here, that's the current Duke of Gloucester, who's also called Richard, and he's the patron of the Richard III Society. He introduces this trial, which is held in the Old Bailey with the Chief Justice of their Supreme Court and a jury of 12 people who were selected because they didn't have any bias one way or the other about Richard III. And you see the barristers in their wigs and their robes arguing and putting up witnesses and evidence, and they put on a great case. And of course, the verdict was not guilty. Richard III was found not guilty of murdering the princes. I should also say the US Supreme Court has had similar trials of the very same subject. They put Richard III to trial several times in various moot court settings. And I'm happy to report in every single one of them, Richard was found not guilty. So finally, I think the third reason Richard III is so controversial is because Shakespeare turned him into, one of the greatest villains of all time. It is through his plays that Richard III is shown as a sociopathic hunchback who has no moral qualms about having his nephews murdered, along with everyone else who stands in his path to the crown. And it's really funny because Shakespeare even has a 7-year-old Richard at the Battle of Towton, which he wasn't there, but he has him at the Battle of Towton, and he kills the Duke of Somerset, who's 30 years old. I mean, can you imagine that? He's Richard III is so evil that even as a 7-year-old, he's able to kill a 30-year-old man. But Shakespeare also accuses him of killing the king, the old king, Henry VI, Henry VI's own son, Prince of Wales. He says that Richard III was the one behind the execution of George, Duke of Clarence. And he also accuses him of killing his own wife, Anne Neville. So it's clear that this caricature is one that is appallingly ruthless. But Shakespeare does what Shakespeare does best, and he makes them one of the most entertaining and witty and funny villains you could ever come across. In fact, I think the audience just can't help but be both horrified and entertained by him. But you know, the real downside of this is that a charismatic character is that, you know, people might actually believe this is actual history or accurate history of a historical figure and never think to do their own research into the real man. And this is why there is a need to educate the public. So that brings me to my final point, and is, who is the Richard III Society and what do we do? You can find out about us on the About Us button on our homepage. And we are one of many branches around the globe. And I think all of the branches across the globe have the singular purpose of educating the public by promoting research into the life and times of Richard III and to secure a reassessment of the material relating to his period and his role in history. As you see, the mission of the American branch here is to bring forward a historically accurate, balanced, and fair assessment of a controversial English king, and to support educational initiatives to interpret his times. The branch connects Americans with the global Ricardian community through joint membership with the Richard III Society in the UK and with one another by organizing events that expand on our knowledge of medieval history. So the one way we promote research is achieved through our publications, which are listed on the right here, the Ricardian Register, which is our research journal. And we have a newsletter. Both of these come out twice a year. We also have a program of Zoom talks that are quarterly, where we present all presentations on all sorts of topics relating to Richard III, the Wars of the Roses, and medieval life. And we have extensive libraries of books that are available to members. These consist of primary sources, secondary sources, and major textbooks by all of the major scholars in the field. And if you look below here, we list all of our programs. And I want to point out the Mary Lou Spooner Shalleck Memorial Graduate Fellowship Awards. This is an endowment where we give each year a $30,000 fellowship to a PhD student who's studying anything related to medieval history, late English medieval history. And we also give 5 dissertation awards of $2,000 each to graduate students. This is administered by the Medieval Academy of America. So applications are made there. They have to demonstrate, obviously, that they have already have undergraduate degrees, that they are currently matriculated with a mentor, and they have to describe in detail what their dissertation subject is and what they intend to do with the money. And there's a board of experts, professors of law, to sort through all the applications and to make the recommendations for who should receive these awards. So that's a major program that we have to support public education. And of course, you may have heard, I've mentioned the UK Richard III Society, and they have abundant other resources at your disposal. And you can find that at the bottom of our homepage. That's their brand, their new logo, and they have a ton of other information that you can look into. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn things over to our membership chair, Wayne, who's going to tell you how to join and manage your membership and other benefits available on our members only page.
Thanks, This is Wayne Ingalls. I'm your membership chair, and I'm sharing my screen, which is taking you to the join page of the of our website. And as we page down, some background information about us. But what this shows us on this part of the site is that we do, by joining the American branch, you do get a 2-for-1 deal. You become part of the American branch, certainly, but you also are part of the CLG, the Company Limited by Guarantee, also known as the Richard III Society in the UK. So your membership gives you all the rights and privileges of the society in the UK as well. So, as Susan's mentioned, some of the benefits of the American branch are shown here, including the publications, the recording register that we publish, but also the UK Society's publications, including the Ricardian Bulletin, the annual Ricardian, the ability to attend and participate in the UK's annual general membership meetings, their AGMs, either by in person or by online, typically by Zoom, last couple of years. So our membership levels, there are several membership levels. The primary one, of course, is the personal level membership for an individual, which is at $60 per year, and you start that process by clicking the join button. We also offer family memberships, so that there are members of your family can participate as well. We have different another level in terms of the Fotheringay membership is at $75 for its additional donation, the Middleham at $180 and Bosworth at $300. And finally, our Plantagenet Angel level of membership is at $500, and that really helps us keep going as a society, keep doing the things that we do as a society. So that is the join part of our website. We also have, this is the members part of our website. And this is where members who are current members go to renew, or it's under the managed membership, which is another way of saying to renew your membership. And this is the link on that page under membership to manage membership. Now, there are some things that you'll need to have non-members can go to this page and see many of the things that are on here, but some of the things will require a membership, and so you have to have the membership password to get to this. And so that one of those things is to borrow books for the nonfiction and the fiction libraries to make that borrow request. You can go to our events calendar showing what events are currently scheduled. Typically, membership is required to register for the events, for our quarterly Zoom talks. There are publications that are behind the membership only wall. There's our current last 2 issues, so the last year's worth of registers are behind the must have a password to get to, but previous issues are available and open to the public. And the Ricardian Chronicle, our newsletter, is also open to the public. Doesn't require you to have the membership password or be a member to access that. Being a member also allows you to go to our governing documents, our bylaws, minutes of board meetings, things of that nature. It does require the membership password to get there, but that is something that we certainly open. We're definitely open to our members seeing what our status is in regards to what our board is working on. We do have volunteer opportunities. You can help out. We've had some members have contacted other board members and have been given some time, donating their time to some special projects to help out with the society. Those are some of the main, those are our page in terms of our membership. And I'll bring you back up to the managed membership just for a moment. We do, what this takes you to is a page that we use as Neon CRM is the link, the page that opens up. That's what we use to manage our membership database. And I will say that in terms of the membership between, or the connection between the UK and the American branch, is that we are definitely close. We send them our membership registration forms, and they send out your membership ID cards for the CLG, and that ID card is what gives you the opportunity to join in, or that membership number rather, to join in on the UK's Zoom talks. For current members, if you change your address or change your phone number, change your email address, please do let us know so that we can pass that on to the UK so they can update your mailing address in their database so that your Ricardian publications from the UK will be shown, or will be showing up in your mailbox and not show up in mine as being refused. I have to find your new address and mail it to you that way. But we'll definitely do that if it comes to be that your membership, or your publication you've moved and gets missent. If they use, UK uses my address as a forwarding address, so I can send you a backup copy, or if your copy comes to me, I can forward it on to your new address. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can open the floor up to questions.
Cheryl, do we have any questions?
There are a few questions. Some of them I've just been trying to answer directly in the chat when I can, but we have one question from Deborah Snyder that I'm going to read out, which may involve spoilers for the movie. So if you don't want to know any spoilers, you may want to cover your ears. Question for this discussion portion. Deborah will be seeing the movie this Wednesday in the only showing in her area and a special screening for a film club at the Alamo in Winchester, Virginia, which sounds pretty cool, for which she will be doing the introduction. Good job, Deborah. In an effort to be relevant but not redundant, does the movie provide exposition of the pro-con arguments about Richard?
No.
No. In short, no.
Yeah, it's really a fictionalized account of Philippa Langley's own life experience. So it's really from her point of view, and you don't get a lot of detail about the pros and cons on Richard III's life. You do see that she's watching the Shakespeare play, and you see the brutal death scene of the king at the end at the hands of Henry Tudor, and you see Philippa being very emotionally moved by it. And then she goes and reads books, and I think she comes to the conclusion that he could not be that bad just because he was a hunchback. It didn't make sense to her because she herself has a medical condition called, we call it chronic fatigue syndrome. So she feels like just because you have a medical condition or are disabled, that doesn't make someone evil or a sociopathic narcissist. That's what I got from the movie, but I think you're pretty much left on your own to pursue other information, which is why we did this presentation.
Another question we have from Eva Arnott. How do we know that the scoliosis began in adolescence?
That was something that the forensic pathologist or osteologist or paleosteologist are expert in. They can tell it by the formation of the bones. And I guess if it was present at birth, the bones would present very differently than they do when they found them. So that's something that scientists can determine just by examining how the bones look today. And they did see some arthritis developing because of the condition. But they definitely eliminated the fact that he had that condition at birth.
Let's see, do we have any other, I don't see any other questions currently.
Someone has their hand raised.
Oh, do they? Oh, okay.
Elaine Streets.
Oh, Elaine Streets. Okay. Elaine, can I
Yes.
unmute you for a moment?
Okay, my question was, when I looked at your family tree, did the fact that the Yorkist line came through a daughter of Edward III rather than a son weaken their claim at all? I know they had a second claim through the fourth son, you know, but all of the Lancasters came through John of Gaunt. So I could you address that, please?
Yeah, that's exactly what the Lancastrians said in response to the Duke of York. They said, you only have a superior ancestor to us because through your mother, Anne Mortimer. And to be honest with you, English law was not settled on this issue. It had been settled in France, something called the Salic laws, which said that no king of France could get his title to the crown through a woman. A woman could not pass on the right to the French crown, and that was cut and dried in France. England, no, it was very, well, as you said, the very foundation of the Plantagenet dynasty was through a woman.
I was just going to make that point, that it really goes back and forth. And eventually you wind up with two queens after Henry VIII, because they're the only survivors, his surviving children.
Correct.
And the Lancastrian side had used that female law of inheritance to have their claim to the throne of France. So this double-edged sword, if Henry V claims to be king of France through the female line, they're not even, I mean, through the female line, they're not even the rightful heirs to the throne of England.
Yeah.
They want their cake and eat it too.
Thank you.
Someone asked if Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded at the Battle of Barnet. And yes, he was wounded at the Battle of Barnet. There is evidence of that in a contemporary account of the battle. It was significant. I believe it was on his arm, but don't quote me on that. It was significant enough that someone observed the seriousness of it. So yes, he was wounded at the Battle of Barnet. Apparently he was able to recover sufficiently in order to fight the next month at the Battle of Tewkesbury and conducted himself very bravely in both battles.
We have a question from Alice of what the timeline seems to indicate is that Richard III was not as evil as suggested by Shakespeare. When did the historical claims start? So I assume that means when did the historical claims of Richard's villainy begin?
As soon as Henry Tudor started reigning. His first attempt was, like I said, to eliminate any copy of Titulus Regius. That was Richard III's claim. And then Henry Tudor, in his first parliament, basically paints Richard III as the worst king ever, without any evidence. It's just, stated, that he was, awful things were happening in England, and rapes and murders, and they talk about the loss of innocent blood, but they don't say anything about who, what, or whom that was referring to. Henry Tudor has an official historian whose name is Polydore Vergil, and he's a humanist who I think comes from France, and he writes the official story of the history of Henry Tudor and the House of Tudor. And it's there that we start to see Richard III being painted as a deformed individual who was not loved by his own mother. And as a result of that, turns to become outwardly vindictive and was always grasping for more and more power. And that line of presentation starts with Polydore Vergil. And then, of course, quote unquote, Saint Thomas More very famous humanist, writes the history of Richard III and continues that tradition until you get to Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, who wrote very popular accounts of this history, and that's what Shakespeare pulled off the shelf when he wrote his plays. So
Sorry, we have Paul Schmidt who has his hand up. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, does the society have an official position on Shakespeare's interpretation? Do you see it as good fun or a terrible historical disservice, or somewhere in between?
well, we're not really in the business of taking official positions because a historical society should be, I guess, a large tent. But to be honest, we take both of those positions. We think it's both fun, but you have to distance yourself from it and not look at it as real history. And we also think it's probably the most damaging character assassination ever committed on someone.
All right. Thank you.
We have a question from Peter Campos. Let's see. If Richard had lived to a ripe old age, how would his scoliosis have progressed and affected him?
Yeah, that's kind of a question for, again, scientists, but as you can imagine, everyone experiences a medical condition in their own way. So someone can have scoliosis and it not affect their life that much. And then someone else can have it and they are terribly affected by it. And I think if you look at those sites on our Meet Richard III page, the UK Scoliosis Society, they say no one can tell what would happen later in life. Children have this corrected surgically because the surgery is now possible when it wasn't possible in the past. But what they do say is that exercise is probably the way to relieve the pain and to limber the muscles and to keep the joint and your back in a healthiest state possible. And we know that Richard was an active man. He was obviously fighting and hunting, and he was noted to be one of the best dancers at court, believe it or not. He was, someone noted that. So he was obviously able to function as a full human being. And of course, if you could speculate, it probably would have gotten worse and it may have been more painful and the arthritis could worsen. But again, every individual is different.
We also know that Dom Smee's armor, for example, no longer fits him because his scoliosis has got worse. So there's a good possibility that it would have continued to get worse over time for him, from what we know from Dominic Smee's experience. He was, of course, who portrayed, or I don't know if it'd be portraying, but yeah, he portrayed Richard's, or the training involved in that. I think it was the Secrets of the Dead video several years ago.
Well, I don't see any more questions. Oh, I do, but I was going to say we're about 20 minutes over, but we'll call on Elaine, who has her hand up.
I wanted to wait until everyone else had. A local continuing ed group here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, has just completed reading Shakespeare's Richard III. And it struck me that there is a small mention of the Titulus Regulus in this play, which says that even though Henry VII tried to destroy it, it was known, if Shakespeare knew about it from the history that he had, and he made it sound as if the common people also had knowledge of this, that it didn't go away. And so that you would think with that, Richard's name could not have been so blackened as Shakespeare presents it. Do you have any more evidence or comment on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this leads me into a big publication that just came out recently by Arthur Kincaid. It's called George Buck, B-U-C, Buck, or Buck, B-U-C-K, The History of Richard III, written by Sir George Buck. And that was James the First Master of Revels or Revelry. He was a big official in the court of James the First, so right near the Elizabethan period. And he wrote the first positive history of King Richard III. at a time where he was able to access primary sources that are no longer available to us because of fire or flood or destruction. And I think he reports on Titulus Regius, but that was written in 1619 or 1609, I forget, something around there. But he also looked at original family archives of the Duke of Norfolk and found papers that we no longer have access to because a fire occurred. So yeah, there were defenders of Richard III verbally, and there's an oral tradition that was passed down, and Sir George Buck reports on that oral tradition. Oh, your mute's on.
Was this in a book by Arthur Kincaid, you said?
Yeah, he's the editor.
Oh,
Sorry, yeah.
okay.
But it's the author is George Buck. The title is The History of Richard III, and the editor is Arthur Kincaid.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? We
Yeah.
have one person with their hand up, Carol Shuffler. Go ahead. Oop, I'll ask you to. Carol, if you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Oops. Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the comments that I made back then that it strikes me is, I think pretty obvious, is that Elizabeth I was a sponsor of Shakespeare's. She apparently gave him money and helped to support him. And one of the reasons she may have made Richard III look so horrible is it would hardly behoove him to write a glowing history of Richard III the way we've heard it today, which I believe is true. And I've fought to say it's true that he was a good man, and he's been wrongfully treated by Shakespeare. But I think, we have to remember who Elizabeth I was. She was a granddaughter of Henry Tudor. And I think that Shakespeare was being very clever when he wrote a history of this story of Richard III, but wasn't particularly flattering to him. But I've always stood by what I've said before, that I think Shakespeare's story, while fun to read, was totally wrong about Richard.
No, you're absolutely right, Carol. People do understand that Shakespeare had to earn his bread and put, food on the table. And he wasn't going to do that by slandering or making the current regime look bad. And they also have to know that Elizabeth I didn't have any children. And there was a real crisis over who was going to succeed her as monarch of England. And there was a lot of people who were falling into factions over that, especially with the religious question involved, whether Catholic or Protestant. And people were falling into factions. And I think Shakespeare used this history to try to moralize against what happens to a people when they fall into factions. It becomes this endless cycle of revenge. And Richard becomes almost the fall guy for the whole thing, And Henry VII comes in like a Deus ex machina, angel out of the sky to fix the land of England. And, but you put your finger right on it. Yeah. So I apologize for going over in my part of the discussion, but I think your questions were excellent, and we are reaching the 90-minute point. So I think we should wrap it up. Wayne, any further comments?
No, I just thank everybody for their attendance, their questions. It was I think it was a very very well done talk, Susan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And our next talk is going to be given by Dr. Compton Reeves. It's going to be June 25th on a Sunday, and we'll put out an announcement about that. It will be also by Zoom. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you here. If you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email at chairperson@r3.org, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And with that, I will say goodbye and have a wonderful rest of the weekend, everyone. thank you for your comments.
Bye-bye.
Here, bye.